Chapter 1. The Night Shift. The yellow beam of headlights cut through the darkness like a knife, illuminating the endless stretch of asphalt ahead. Michael Anderson's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of his 18-wheeler, his eyes fixed on the highway before him. At 47, his face bore the marks of a man who had spent countless nights just like this one, traversing the lonely roads that connected America's cities and towns. The dashboard clock read 2:17 a.m., and the radio crackled with late-night country music, providing a familiar soundtrack to his solitary journey. Michael adjusted his posture in the worn leather seat, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back, a constant reminder of the long hours he spent on the road. The bills piling up at home made these extra night shifts necessary, even though his daughter Sarah kept telling him to slow down. "Dad, you're working too hard," she'd said during their last phone call. "I'm worried about you." Her voice, so much like her mother's, had carried that same concerned tone that Jenny used to have. The divorce 5 years ago had left him with more than just emotional scars. The financial burden of starting over at 42 had been overwhelming. The interstate stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of black cutting through the Nevada desert. The cargo in his trailer needed to reach Salt Lake City by morning, and he was making good time despite the exhaustion creeping at the edges of his consciousness. The coffee in his thermos had gone cold hours ago, but he took another sip anyway, grimacing at the bitter taste. Through the windshield, the stars twinkled above, impossibly bright away from the city lights. It was moments like these when Michael felt both completely alone and strangely at peace with his solitude. The job might be demanding, but there was something therapeutic about these quiet hours, when the world seemed to belong only to him and the handful of other night travelers sharing the road. A glimmer of white caught his eye in the distance, appearing like a mirage in his headlights. As he drew closer, the shape began to take form, a figure standing at the side of the road. Michael's 25 years of experience had taught him to be cautious, but something about this scene made him slow down. The figure was an elderly woman in a white dress, her silver hair reflecting the moonlight, looking completely out of place on this desolate stretch of highway. He eased his foot off the accelerator, years of instinct warring with concern. The woman raised her hand weakly, and even from a distance, he could see the exhaustion in her posture. Making a decision, Michael carefully guided his truck onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under the massive tires as he came to a stop. "Ma'am," he called out, rolling down his window. "Are you all right?" The woman approached slowly, her movements uncertain. As she stepped into the glow of his headlights, Michael could see that she was well into her 70s, her face lined with age and current distress. Her white dress was wrinkled, and she clutched a small handbag close to her chest. "Oh, thank heavens," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been walking for hours. The bus, I must have fallen asleep, and when I woke up..." She trailed off, clearly disoriented. Michael's protective instincts kicked in. He couldn't leave an elderly woman stranded in the middle of nowhere, regardless of the schedule he was trying to keep. "Let me help you," he said, already reaching for his phone to call his dispatcher. "There's a town about 30 miles ahead with a hospital. We should get you checked out." As he climbed down from the cab, the woman swayed slightly, and he quickly moved to steady her. She looked up at him with grateful eyes, but there was something else in her expression, something that made Michael pause, though he couldn't quite place it. It was like seeing a familiar face in a crowd, only to realize it was a stranger after all. "Thank you, young man," she said softly. "You're very kind." Michael helped her into the passenger seat, noticing how her hands trembled as she gripped the handrail. Once she was settled, he made a quick call to his dispatcher, explaining the situation. To his relief, they agreed to send another driver to take over his delivery, allowing him to help the woman get medical attention. As they pulled back onto the highway, Michael glanced at his unexpected passenger. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. There was something about her profile that tickled at the edges of his memory, but he dismissed it as a trick of the late hour and his tired mind. "I'm Michael," he offered, trying to put her at ease. "Can I ask your name, ma'am?" The woman turned to look at him, and in that moment, the overhead lights of a passing truck illuminated her face clearly for the first time. Her answer came just as recognition dawned in Michael's eyes, sending a jolt of shock through his system that made his hands tighten on the steering wheel. "Eleanor," she said quietly. "Eleanor Anderson." The name hit him like a physical blow. Eleanor Anderson, his father's second wife, the woman who had turned his teenage years into a nightmare and ultimately driven him away from home. The last time he had seen her was 25 years ago, on the day he'd walked out of his father's house vowing never to return. The highway stretched before them, dark and endless, as past and present collided in the cab of his truck. Neither spoke for several long moments. The only sound the steady hum of the engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt, while the weight of their shared history hung in the air between them. Chapter 2. Ghosts of Yesterday. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room cast harsh shadows across Eleanor's face as she sat in a wheelchair, looking smaller and more fragile than Michael remembered. He stood a few feet away, his mind racing with memories he'd spent years trying to forget. The teenage boy who had once fled from this woman's cutting remarks and manipulative behavior was now a grown man, watching as nurses checked her vital signs. "Blood pressure's a bit low," one of the nurses commented, making notes on her chart. "We'll need to run some tests, Mrs. Anderson. You're severely dehydrated." Michael paced the waiting room, his phone pressed to his ear as he updated Sarah about the situation. "I can't just leave her here," he explained to his daughter, his voice low. "I know what she did to us." "But, Dad," Sarah interrupted, concern evident in her voice. "Are you sure you want to get involved? After everything she put you through? I remember the stories you told me about her." He gazed through the emergency room doors, watching as Eleanor answered the nurse's questions. "I'm not that angry teenager anymore, Sarah, and she's not the same person either. You should see her. She looks so lost." The memories flooded back unbidden. Eleanor's arrival in their lives when he was 14, just 2 years after his mother's divorce from his father. At first, she had seemed perfect, charming, elegant, and attentive to his father's needs. But behind closed doors, she had systematically worked to drive a wedge between father and son. "Your father needs to focus on his new life," she would say, her voice honey-sweet, but her words sharp as razors. "You're old enough to understand that, aren't you, Michael?" Gradually, his father had become more distant, missing Michael's football games, forgetting parent-teacher conferences, treating his son more like a houseguest than family. The final straw came during his senior year of high school, when Eleanor convinced his father that Michael's dream of attending college in California was an act of rebellion rather than ambition. "I'll call you back, honey," Michael told Sarah, ending the call as a doctor approached Eleanor's bed. He moved closer, catching snippets of their conversation. Exhaustion, confusion, mild hypothermia. The doctor's words painted a picture of an elderly woman who had been fortunate to survive her ordeal. "Mrs. Anderson," the doctor said, reviewing her chart, "can you tell me how you ended up on that highway?" Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. "I was visiting my sister in Los Angeles. I took the bus back to Denver, but I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, I was in a town I didn't recognize. I got confused, tried to find my way back." Her voice cracked. "I've been wandering for days." Michael felt a strange mix of emotions watching her. Pity, residual anger, and something else he couldn't quite name. The Eleanor he remembered would never have admitted to being confused or lost. She had always been perfectly put together, controlling every situation with an iron will beneath her elegant exterior. "We'll need to keep you overnight for observation," the doctor explained. "Is there someone we can call for you?" Eleanor's eyes darted to Michael, then away. "My husband, Robert Anderson. But we're not. We haven't spoken in years." She paused, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not since Michael left." The admission hit Michael like a physical blow. He hadn't known that his departure had affected his father's marriage. In all these years, he'd assumed they had continued their perfect life without him, just as Eleanor had wanted. A nurse approached him with admission forms. "Are you family?" she asked. Michael hesitated, 25 years of hurt warring with the compassion he'd learned to cultivate in his adult years. "Yes," he finally answered. "I'm her stepson." Eleanor's head snapped up at his words, her eyes filling with tears. For the first time, Michael saw something in them he'd never witnessed before. regret. "Michael," she said, her voice trembling, "you didn't have to stay. After recognizing me, after everything." He pulled a chair closer to her bed, not quite ready for forgiveness, but no longer burning with the anger of his youth. "Get some rest, Eleanor. We can talk tomorrow." As she drifted off to sleep, Michael sent a text to his dispatcher, requesting a few days of personal leave. Then he called Sarah again, this time to ask her to do some research. "Can you find out what happened to Grandpa Robert, your grandfather? I think it's time I knew." The night settled around them, the quiet beeping of hospital machines marking time as Michael watched over the woman who had once shattered his family. Outside the window, the desert stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath them, while inside, the first tentative threads of reconciliation began to weave themselves into existence. Chapter 3. The Weight of Time. The morning sun filtered through the hospital window, casting long shadows across Eleanor's sleeping form. Michael had dozed off in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, his neck stiff from the awkward position. His phone buzzed, waking him. Another message from Sarah. "Found him." Her text read, "Grandpa Robert still lives in the old house in Denver. He never remarried after Eleanor left him 12 years ago. He owns a small bookstore downtown. Dad, he's been trying to find you." Michael's throat tightened as he read the message again. 12 years. Eleanor had left his father, and he'd never known. All this time, he'd carried the image of them living their perfect life without him, using it as a shield against his own pain. Eleanor stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked disoriented for a moment before her gaze settled on Michael. "You're still here," she said softly, surprise evident in her voice. "I am," he replied, straightening in his chair. "The doctor said you can be discharged this afternoon if your tests come back normal." She nodded, pushing herself up to sit straighter in the bed. The morning light was unforgiving, highlighting every line on her face, every mark of the years that had passed. She looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. "I don't deserve your kindness, Michael," she said finally. "I've thought about you every day for the past 12 years, about all the hurt I caused." Michael leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "What happened, Eleanor?" "Sarah found out you left Dad 12 years ago. The Eleanor I knew would never have left her perfect life." A bitter smile crossed her face. "Perfect life? Is that what you thought I had?" She shook her head slowly. "After you left, everything changed. Robert, your father, he was never the same. He blamed me, and he was right to do so. I had driven away his only son with my jealousy and insecurity." "Jealousy?" Michael asked, confused. "Of what?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Of the bond you shared with him, of how his face lit up when he talked about you. I was so afraid of being second best, of not being enough, that I made sure I would be his only priority. I didn't realize that in doing so, I would lose everything that made him the man I loved." A nurse entered with breakfast, interrupting their conversation. As Eleanor picked at her food, Michael stood by the window, looking out at the hospital parking lot below. His truck sat there, a reminder of the life he'd built for himself after leaving home. "I started driving trucks because of Dad," he said quietly. "Remember how he used to take me on short hauls during summer breaks? Those were the best days of my childhood. Even after Mom left, those trips were our special time together." Eleanor set down her fork. "He kept your room exactly as you left it. For years he would sit in there on Sunday afternoons, looking through your old photo albums. I couldn't stand seeing his pain, knowing I had caused it. So I left. I couldn't bear to face what I had done to both of you." Michael turned back to face her. "And now, what were you doing in Los Angeles?" "Trying to make amends," she admitted. "I've been seeing a therapist for the past few years. She helped me understand my actions, my fears. I went to Los Angeles to reconcile with my sister, another relationship I had ruined with my controlling behavior. I thought if I could fix things with her, maybe someday I could find the courage to reach out to you and Robert." Sarah's latest text flashed on Michael's phone. Grandpa's number attached. "He really wants to talk to you, Dad." Michael studied Eleanor's face, seeing not the manipulative stepmother of his youth, but a woman who had fought her own battles, made her own mistakes, and was trying to find her way to redemption. "I have Dad's number," he said finally. "He wants to talk to me. Has for years, apparently." Eleanor's eyes widened. "He deserves to hear from you. He deserves to know the wonderful man you've become. A father yourself, a hard worker, a kind person who would help even someone who hurt him so deeply." "And what about you?" Michael asked. "What do you deserve?" She met his gaze steadily. "Nothing. I deserve nothing from you, Michael. But I want you to know that I am truly sorry. Sorry for letting my own insecurities poison what could have been a real family. Sorry for robbing you and your father of years together." The morning sun had climbed higher, warming the room. From the hallway came the sounds of hospital life. Nurses chatting, equipment being moved, families visiting loved ones. In that moment, Michael felt the weight of the past lifting slightly from his shoulders. "I'm not ready to forgive everything," he said honestly. "But I'm willing to try to understand, and maybe it's time I called Dad." Eleanor smiled through her tears. "Your father always said you had the biggest heart of anyone he knew. I wish I had seen that instead of feeling threatened by it." Michael pulled out his phone, staring at his father's number on the screen. 25 years of silence stretched between him and that simple string of digits. Behind him, Eleanor watched quietly, her breakfast forgotten, as he took the first step toward bridging that vast divide. The hospital room fell silent except for the soft beeping of monitors and the sound of Michael's finger hovering over the call button, time seeming to hold its breath as past and future hung in perfect balance. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Past. Michael's thumb trembled slightly as it hovered over the call button. Eleanor held her breath, the breakfast tray forgotten between them. The morning sunlight seemed to pause its journey across the hospital room floor, as if nature itself was waiting for this moment. "Hello?" The voice that answered was older than Michael remembered, rougher around the edges, but unmistakably his father's. For a moment Michael couldn't speak, his throat constricting with emotion. "Dad," he finally managed, the word feeling foreign on his tongue after so many years. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Michael," Robert's voice cracked. "Son, is it really you?" Eleanor watched as tears formed in Michael's eyes. She turned away, giving him privacy, but could still hear both sides of the conversation in the quiet hospital room. "Yeah, Dad, it's me. I found Eleanor, or rather, she found me. She's in the hospital, but she's okay." "Eleanor?" The surprise in Robert's voice was evident. "Where? What happened?" Michael explained the events of the previous night, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. As he talked, he paced the small hospital room, years of unspoken words pressing against the dam of his restraint. "I've been driving trucks, Dad, just like you used to. Sarah's grown now. She's 24. You're a grandfather." The silence on the other end was broken by a muffled sob. "I know, son. I've followed your life from afar. The bookstore. I have a whole shelf of photos behind the counter. Customers probably think I'm crazy, showing them pictures of a granddaughter I've never met, telling them about my son, the truck driver." Eleanor couldn't hold back her own tears now, listening to the pain and love in Robert's voice. She remembered the countless times she'd caught him staring at those photos in the bookstore, too proud to reach out, too afraid of rejection. "Dad," Michael's voice was thick with emotion, "I'm sorry I stayed away so long. I thought you had chosen a different life, one that didn't include me." "Never." Robert's response was immediate. "You're my son, Michael. There hasn't been a single day I haven't missed you. When Eleanor left, she made me see how I'd failed you." "Failed us all." Michael glanced at Eleanor, who was studiously examining her hands in her lap. "Where are you now, Dad?" "At the bookstore. I open early on Thursdays for the morning reading group. The hospital's releasing Eleanor this afternoon. We're in Carson City. I could drive her back to Denver, if that's okay." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. "You'd do that?" "Both of you come?" "Yeah, Dad. I think it's time. Sarah can fly out and meet us there. If you want to meet her, that is." "Want to?" Robert's laugh was watery. "Michael, my entire back office is filled with Christmas and birthday presents I bought for her over the years. never knowing if I'd get the chance to give them to her. Eleanor spoke up suddenly, her voice trembling. "Robert, I'm so sorry. For everything." There was a long pause before Robert responded, his voice gentle. "I know, Ellie. I think we all have some healing to do." Michael sat heavily in the visitor's chair. "Dad, I need to make some calls. Arrange for another driver to take my cargo. Let Sarah know the plan. Can I call you back in a bit?" "Of course, son. I'll be here. I've always been here." After ending the call, Michael sat in silence for several minutes, processing the conversation. Eleanor watched him carefully, seeing the emotions play across his face. "He still calls me Ellie," she said softly. "After everything I did." Michael turned to her. "You know this won't be easy, right? There's a lot of hurt to work through." "I know," she nodded. "But maybe that's what family is. Not the perfect image I tried to force, but the willingness to work through the hard parts together." Sarah's text alert chimed on Michael's phone. "Found a flight to Denver for tomorrow morning. Dad, are you sure about this?" As Michael began typing his response, a nurse entered with Eleanor's discharge papers. The morning sun had fully risen now, filling the room with golden light that seemed to promise new beginnings. "Your father's bookstore," Michael said suddenly, looking up from his phone. "What's it called?" Eleanor smiled, remembering the day Robert had opened it. "Second Chapters. He said everyone deserves another chance to tell their story." Michael nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Second Chapters. I like that." He stood, stretching his tired muscles. "I'll make some calls. Get us cleared for the drive to Denver. It's about 12 hours from here." "Michael," Eleanor called as he headed for the door to make his calls. "Thank you. Not just for helping me last night, but for being willing to try. Your father was right. You do have the biggest heart." Outside the hospital room, Michael leaned against the wall, his phone in his hand. Ahead lay a 12-hour drive with his former stepmother, a reunion with his father, and the first meeting between 3 generations of Andersons. It was terrifying and hopeful all at once, like standing on the edge of a cliff and finally being ready to spread your wings. Chapter 5. The Long Road Home. The afternoon sun beat down on Michael's truck as they pulled out of the hospital parking lot. Eleanor sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching a small bag containing her belongings. The hospital had given her fresh clothes, simple sweats and a t-shirt that made her look startlingly different from the elegant woman Michael remembered from his youth. "It's about 12 hours to Denver," Michael said, breaking the silence as they merged onto the highway. "We should stop for the night somewhere in Utah." "You're still recovering." Eleanor nodded, her eyes fixed on the landscape rolling past. "I never understood why you loved trucking so much," she mused. "I used to tell your father it was beneath him, that he should find a more respectable career." She paused, laughing softly. "Now I think I'm beginning to see the appeal. There's something peaceful about it." "Dad used to say the road gives you time to think," Michael replied, adjusting his mirrors. "Said sometimes you need to move forward to figure out where you've been." His phone buzzed with another text from Sarah, displayed on the dashboard screen. "Flight booked for 9 a.m. tomorrow. Grandpa's setting up the apartment above his bookstore for us." "Dad, he's so excited." Eleanor watched as a smile crossed Michael's face. "Sarah seems like a wonderful young woman," she said carefully. "You've done a good job raising her." "She's the best thing in my life," Michael agreed. "After her mother and I divorced, Sarah was my anchor. She never let me wallow in self-pity, kept pushing me to be better." They fell into a comfortable silence as the miles rolled by. The Nevada desert gradually gave way to the salt flats of Utah, an otherworldly landscape that stretched to the horizon. Eleanor dozed occasionally, still tired from her ordeal, while Michael settled into the familiar rhythm of the road. Around sunset, they stopped at a small diner just outside Salt Lake City. As they sat in a worn booth, Eleanor pushed her salad around her plate, clearly lost in thought. "I've been thinking about your father's bookstore," she said finally. "Second Chapters. He bought the building right after I left. I used to drive by sometimes, too afraid to go in. I'd watch him through the window, arranging books, talking with customers. He seemed peaceful." Michael set down his coffee cup. "Why did you never reach out? To either of us?" Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she folded her napkin. Shame, mostly. And fear. The older I got, the more I realized how my own insecurities had poisoned everything good in my life. My therapist helped me understand that I had a pattern of pushing people away before they could reject me. She looked up at Michael. Your mother's divorce hit Robert hard. When we met, he was still raw from it. I convinced myself that I had to make him choose, me, or any reminder of his past life. Including his son, Michael said quietly. Including his son, she agreed, her voice heavy with regret. I was so wrong, Michael. I thought I was protecting my happiness, but I was just destroying it piece by piece. The waitress refilled their coffee cups, and Michael watched the steam rise in the dimming light. You know what I remember most about that time? He asked. Not the arguments or the cold shoulders. I remember the day you threw out my mother's old cookbook. Dad had kept it because it had all our favorite recipes, the cookies we made every Christmas, the spaghetti sauce that took all day to simmer. You said we needed to make new traditions. Eleanor's face crumpled. I found it later, in the recycling bin. Robert had rescued it. He kept it hidden in his study. After I left, he moved it to the kitchen counter. I saw it there the last time I drove by the house. Michael's phone lit up again. Another text from Sarah. Just packed. Dad, I found Mom's old photo albums. Should I bring them? There are some great pictures of you and Grandpa from when you were my age. Yes, Michael typed back. Bring everything. The sun had fully set now, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. They decided to get a room at a nearby motel, both too tired to continue driving. As they walked from the diner to the motel, Eleanor stopped suddenly. Michael, she said, her voice uncertain, there's something else you should know. About why I was really in Los Angeles. He turned to face her, seeing the struggle in her expression. The parking lot lights cast long shadows around them, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed mournfully. I wasn't just visiting my sister, she continued. I was getting test results. Medical ones. They're not what I hoped for. Michael felt a familiar twist in his gut, the same one he'd felt when Sarah had been hospitalized with appendicitis years ago. The helpless worry for family, even complicated family. How bad? He asked softly. Eleanor's smile was brave but trembling. Let's just say I understand now why it's so important not to waste time on pride and fear. Second chapters don't last forever, Michael. Sometimes we get a chance to rewrite our story, but we have to be brave enough to pick up the pen. Under the vast Utah sky, standing in a motel parking lot, stepmother and stepson faced each other across years of hurt and misunderstanding. But now, something new was growing in that space between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps understanding. And sometimes, understanding is where healing begins. Chapter 6. Dawn's early light. The motel room's thin curtains did little to block out the first rays of morning sun. Michael sat in the room's single chair, watching the sunrise while Eleanor slept. He'd barely closed his eyes all night, his mind racing with Eleanor's revelation and the impending reunion with his father. His phone showed a text from Robert sent at 3 a.m. Can't sleep. Spent the night reorganizing the bookstore apartment. Found your old high school yearbook. Remember when you won that writing contest? I still have your story framed in my office. Michael did remember. The story had been about a boy who built a time machine to fix his past mistakes, only to realize that every change he made erased something precious from his present. His English teacher had called it surprisingly mature for a 16-year-old. Eleanor had called it a waste of time that could have been spent on college applications. Eleanor stirred, sitting up slowly. Her silver hair caught the morning light, creating a halo effect that made her look unexpectedly vulnerable. How long have you known? Michael asked quietly. About the medical situation? She smoothed the motel bedspread, buying time before answering. The symptoms started about 6 months ago. The doctors in Denver were uncertain, so I sought a second opinion in Los Angeles. They're giving me about a year, maybe 18 months with treatment. Does Dad know? No one knows except my sister. Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. I was planning to start treatment in Denver next month. I didn't expect any of this. Finding you, the possibility of reconciliation. It feels like more than I deserve. Michael stood, pacing the small room. Why didn't you tell me last night, when we were making plans? Because I didn't want your pity, she replied firmly. And I didn't want it to influence your decision about reconnecting with your father. That needs to be about healing, not obligation. The sun had fully risen now, painting the room in warm golden light. Michael's phone buzzed. Sarah had boarded her flight to Denver. In a few hours, she would meet the grandfather she'd never known, and Michael would face his father for the first time in 25 years. We should get going, he said finally. It's about 6 hours to Denver from here. Sarah's flight lands at noon. They checked out of the motel and found a small cafe for breakfast. Over coffee and toast, Eleanor watched Michael typing a message to Sarah. Tell me about her, Eleanor said suddenly. About Sarah. What was she like growing up? Michael's face softened. Stubborn. Brilliant. She skipped 2 grades in school, graduated high school at 16, but she never lost her kindness. Even after the divorce, when things were rough, she would leave little notes around the house to make me smile. Like mother, like son, Eleanor murmured. At Michael's questioning look, she continued, You used to do that for your father, remember? Little drawings, jokes written on post-it notes. He kept them all in a box in his study. The waitress refilled their coffee cups, and Michael stirred his absently. Did you ever want children of your own? Eleanor's smile was tinged with sadness. I thought I wasn't cut out for it. Too selfish, too focused on my career. Now I wonder if I was just afraid. Afraid of not being perfect, afraid of being left behind. Watching you with Sarah, even from a distance. I think I might have been wrong about a lot of things. They hit the road as the morning traffic was thinning out. The landscape changed gradually as they drove east, the stark beauty of Utah giving way to the approaching Rocky Mountains. Eleanor dozed off and on, the medication from the hospital still in her system. During one of her wakeful periods, she turned to Michael. Your father's bookstore. It's not just a business, you know. It's his way of keeping stories alive. He has this special section, all books about fathers and sons, about forgiveness and second chances. The customers think it's just good marketing, but I know better. Michael gripped the steering wheel tighter. You've been watching him all these years? From a distance, she admitted. Every few months I'd drive by. Sometimes I'd see him through the window reading to children during story time. He does all the voices, just like he used to do for you. The Rocky Mountains loomed larger on the horizon, their snow-capped peaks piercing the blue sky. Michael's phone showed another text from Sarah. Landed in Denver. Grandpa's here at the airport. Dad. He's crying. Good tears, I think. We're waiting for you. Eleanor read the message on the dashboard display. Are you ready for this? Michael checked his mirrors, changed lanes smoothly. No, he answered honestly. But I don't think anyone's ever really ready for second chances. We just have to be brave enough to take them when they come. Even if they don't last. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. Especially then, Michael replied, thinking of Sarah's birth, how holding her for the first time had taught him that some moments were worth any amount of pain that might follow. Maybe the fact that things don't last forever is what makes them precious. Denver's skyline appeared in the distance, a promise and a challenge all at once. In the passenger seat, Eleanor straightened her shoulders, as if preparing for battle. Or perhaps, Michael thought, watching her from the corner of his eye, preparing for peace. Chapter 7. The bookstore on Maple Street. Second chapters stood on the corner of Maple and 3rd, a 3-story brick building with large display windows filled with carefully arranged books. Michael parked his truck across the street, his hand still gripping the steering wheel, even after turning off the engine. Through the window, he could see warm lighting inside the store, and silhouettes moving about. It's exactly as I remember it, Eleanor said softly. Robert always loved those bay windows. Said they let the stories reach out to people passing by. Michael's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. We're inside. Grandpa's practically bouncing off the walls. He's shown me every baby picture he has of you. Also, Dad, this place is amazing. We should go in, Michael said, but didn't move. Eleanor watched him carefully. We can take a moment if you need it. 25 years, he murmured. I've driven past Denver hundreds of times, hauling cargo. Never knew he was here, surrounded by books, keeping my memory alive. They sat in silence for a few more minutes, watching the afternoon sun play off the bookstore's windows. A sign in the display announced "Story Time every Thursday," in cheerful letters, surrounded by children's books about family, forgiveness, and new beginnings. Finally, Michael opened his door. "Ready?" Eleanor nodded, gathering her courage. They crossed the street together, their reflections growing clearer in the bookstore windows with each step. Before they could reach for the handle, the door swung open. Sarah stood there, her eyes bright with tears. "Dad," she whispered, then threw herself into his arms. Over her shoulder, Michael saw him. Robert Anderson, his father, standing behind the counter. He was older, his hair completely gray now, but his eyes were the same, crinkling at the corners just as Michael remembered. Their gazes met across the space between them, 25 years dissolving in an instant. "Michael!" Robert's voice broke on the name. He moved from behind the counter with surprising speed for a man his age. Michael found himself walking forward, Sarah still holding his arm. They met in the middle of the store, among shelves of books that held countless stories of reunion and redemption. Robert reached out tentatively, as if afraid his son might disappear if he moved too quickly. "You look just like your mother," Robert said, his hand touching Michael's cheek. "She always said you'd grow into your eyes." The dam broke. Michael pulled his father into a fierce embrace, feeling the years of absence and longing pour out of both of them. Sarah wrapped her arms around them both, 3 generations of Andersons finally together. Eleanor stood quietly by the door, watching the scene unfold. Robert looked up, seeing her there, and something softened in his expression. "Ellie," he said gently, "come here." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to intrude." "This is your moment. The moment belongs to all of us," Robert insisted. "This is about family. All of it. The mistakes, the regrets, the second chances. Come here." Michael stepped back, keeping one arm around Sarah, and watched as Eleanor slowly approached. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile than the commanding presence he remembered from his youth. Robert took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Welcome home," he said simply. Around them, the bookstore seemed to hold its breath. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the bay windows, casting long shadows among the shelves. The smell of old books and fresh coffee filled the air. Robert had kept the small cafe corner that Eleanor had once insisted would never work in a bookstore. Sarah wiped her eyes and looked around. "This place is incredible, Grandpa." "Dad, have you seen his collection of first editions? And there's an entire section dedicated to truck drivers' stories." Robert smiled sheepishly. "I might have developed a specialty over the years. Every time I heard about a book featuring long-haul truckers, I ordered it. Kept me feeling connected somehow. The apartment upstairs is ready," he continued. I thought we could all have dinner together. I still make that spaghetti sauce from your mother's cookbook, Michael. Never quite got it right, but..." "It was never about getting it right, Dad," Michael said softly. "It was about trying. About keeping the memory alive." Eleanor swayed slightly, and Robert steadied her with a concerned look. "You should rest, Ellie. The guest room's made up." Michael caught the unspoken question in his father's eyes and nodded slightly. They would talk about Eleanor's condition later. For now, this moment of reunion deserved to exist untouched by shadows. "Before that," Eleanor said, "I'd love to see what you've done with the place, Robert. This store. It's more beautiful than I could have imagined." As Robert led them through the store, pointing out special collections and sharing stories about favorite customers, Michael watched his father's face come alive with passion. This wasn't just a bookstore. It was a temple of second chances, each volume on its shelves holding the possibility of new beginnings. Sarah linked her arm through his. "You okay, Dad?" Michael looked at his daughter, then at his father, showing Eleanor a shelf of poetry books, their heads bent together over a volume of Frost. "Yeah," he said. "I think I really am." Chapter 8. Stories Untold. The apartment above the bookstore was warm and inviting, filled with the aroma of simmering sauce and fresh bread. Robert had indeed kept his ex-wife's cookbook, and now it lay open on the kitchen counter, its pages worn and stained with years of use. Sarah stood beside her grandfather at the stove, watching intently as he added herbs to the sauce. "The secret," Robert was saying, "is to let the basil leaves steep whole, then remove them before serving. Your grandmother taught me that." Michael sat at the kitchen table, watching them bond over the familiar recipe. Eleanor had retreated to the guest room to rest, the emotional weight of the day taking its toll. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the apartment's windows. "Dad," Sarah called over her shoulder, "Grandpa says you used to help cook this every Sunday. He says you were the official taste tester." "Best job in the house," Michael smiled. "Though I remember someone used to say it was a waste of time, that we should be focusing on more important things." He paused, the old bitterness rising unexpectedly. Robert turned from the stove. "We all made mistakes, son. Me most of all. I let someone else's fears dictate my relationship with my own child." "No, Dad." Michael shook his head. "Eleanor already explained. I understand now. She was scared, insecure. But you could have fought harder for me." The kitchen fell silent, except for the quiet bubbling of the sauce. Sarah busied herself with the bread, giving them privacy while remaining close enough to support her father. "You're right," Robert said finally. "I was weak. After your mother left, I was so afraid of being alone that I let Eleanor's insecurities become my prison. By the time I realized what I'd lost, you were gone." He moved to sit across from Michael at the table. "The day you left, I found that story you wrote for the contest, the one about the time machine. Remember what the boy learned at the end?" Michael nodded slowly. "That changing the past might fix some things, but it would erase all the good that came from learning to live with our mistakes. I've read that story at least 100 times over the years," Robert admitted. "Kept it framed in my office downstairs. Customers always ask about it, and I tell them it was written by my son, the wisest 16-year-old I ever knew." Sarah joined them at the table, bringing 3 cups of coffee. "Dad never told me he wrote stories." "Oh, he was quite the writer." Robert's eyes crinkled with pride. "Had a whole notebook full of them. Used to write about the trucks he saw on the highway. Imagine where they were going, what stories they were carrying." A soft sound from the doorway made them turn. Eleanor stood there looking tired but determined. "I remember those stories," she said quietly. "I found them once, when I was cleaning. Instead of encouraging your talent, I told you to focus on practical subjects." She moved into the kitchen, her steps careful. "I found one of them years later in a box in the basement, about a truck driver who delivered dreams instead of cargo. It was beautiful, Michael." Michael felt his throat tighten. "I still write sometimes," he admitted. "Short pieces, mostly. About people I meet on the road, stories I hear at truck stops." "Show them," Sarah encouraged. "Dad, show them your blog." "Blog?" Robert and Eleanor asked simultaneously. Michael felt his cheeks warm. "It's nothing fancy, just a collection of stories from the road. Tales from the long haul, I call it. It has a decent following among other drivers." Robert's face lit up. "Wait here," he said, hurrying from the room. He returned moments later with a laptop. "Show me?" As Michael pulled up the blog, Eleanor moved to check the source, adding a pinch of salt after tasting it. The familiar domestic scene felt surreal. His father leaning over his shoulder to read. Sarah setting the table, Eleanor cooking in the kitchen they had once shared. "Michael," Robert breathed, scrolling through the stories. "These are incredible. Why didn't you tell me?" "How could I?" Michael asked softly. "We hadn't spoken in 25 years. Eleanor returned to the table, her hand resting briefly on Michael's shoulder. "We've all been keeping our stories to ourselves for too long," she said. "Maybe it's time we shared them." Sarah looked up from setting the last plate. "Like that section in the bookstore, the one about second chances?" Robert nodded. "That's exactly why I created it. Every book there is about people finding their way back to each other. Some took years, some decades, but they all have one thing in common. They had to be brave enough to take the first step." "Speaking of being brave," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands, "there's something I need to tell you, Robert. about why I was in Los Angeles. Michael watched his father's face, saw the moment he registered the seriousness in Eleanor's tone. Sarah quietly excused herself, mentioning something about checking the bread, giving them privacy for what was to come. The kitchen timer chimed, marking the end of the sauce's simmering time. Outside, the last rays of sunlight painted the Denver sky in shades of purple and gold. In this warm kitchen, surrounded by the smell of his mother's recipe and the weight of unspoken words, Michael realized that some stories need to be told even when we're afraid of their endings. Chapter 9. The Weight of Words. The kitchen timer's chime faded into a heavy silence. Eleanor sat at the table, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, as if seeking warmth. Robert waited patiently, his face showing the same gentle concern Michael remembered from his childhood, the look that could make anyone feel safe enough to share their deepest fears. "I've been seeing doctors," Eleanor began, her voice barely above a whisper. "First in Denver, then in Los Angeles for a second opinion. The diagnosis, it's not good, Robert." "They're giving me a year, maybe a little more." The color drained from Robert's face. "Ellie," he reached across the table, taking her trembling hands in his. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I didn't think I had the right," she admitted. "After everything I'd done, all the years I'd stayed away. I couldn't bear the thought of coming back just to—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah returned to the kitchen, moving quietly to stand behind her father's chair, her hand resting supportively on his shoulder. The sauce continued to simmer on the stove, its familiar aroma now a poignant reminder of how time could make even the most ordinary moments precious. "Treatment?" Robert asked, his voice rough with emotion. "There are options," Eleanor nodded. "Nothing curative, but they might give me more time. The doctors in Denver have a plan, but—" She glanced around the kitchen, at the family she had once torn apart and was only now reuniting with. "I never expected to have something worth having more time for." Michael stood abruptly, moving to the stove. He began stirring the sauce, needing something to do with his hands. "You'll stay here," he said firmly, not turning around. "The treatment center in Denver. It's one of the best in the country. And you'll need—" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You'll need family." Robert squeezed Eleanor's hands. "Michael's right. The apartment has plenty of room. The guest room is yours for as long as you need it." "I can't impose," Eleanor began, but Sarah interrupted her. "It's not imposing," she said softly. "It's family. Messy and complicated and not always perfect, but family nonetheless." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "After everything I did, the past is the past," Robert said firmly. "We can't change it, but we can choose how we move forward." He looked up at Michael, still standing at the stove. "Son?" Michael finally turned around, his eyes meeting Eleanor's. "When I was 16, I wrote that story about the time machine. The boy wanted to go back and fix all his mistakes, make everything perfect. But in the end, he realized that perfect isn't real. It's the imperfect moments, the hard ones, that make us who we are." He moved back to the table, taking the seat next to Eleanor. "You tried to make our family perfect and it broke us. But maybe now we can try being real instead." Sarah went to the stove, rescuing the sauce before it could burn. "I'll finish dinner," she offered. "You all keep talking." Robert hadn't let go of Eleanor's hands. "Remember when we first bought this building?" he asked her. "You thought I was crazy, wanting to open a bookstore at my age." "I thought a lot of foolish things back then," Eleanor admitted. "I was so focused on appearances, on what other people might think. I missed the beauty in simple dreams." "Like a father and son cooking sauce on Sundays?" Michael suggested, his voice gentle. "Like that," Eleanor nodded. "Like poetry readings in a bookstore. Like truck drivers who write stories about the people they meet on the road." Sarah returned to the table with a fresh pot of coffee. "The bread's ready," she announced. "And Grandpa, I found something interesting on one of your shelves while I was checking the kitchen. A journal full of letters." Robert's eyes widened. "You found those? Letters?" Michael asked. Robert stood, moving to a shelf near the kitchen window. He returned with a leather-bound journal, its pages thick with use. "I wrote to you," he explained, holding the journal out to Michael. "Every Sunday after you left. I never sent them, didn't know where to send them, but I couldn't bear the thought of not talking to you." Michael took the journal with trembling hands. "Every Sunday?" "For 25 years, Robert confirmed. "Sometimes I wrote about the store. Sometimes about memories of you growing up. Sometimes I just wrote about how much I missed you." Eleanor watched as Michael opened the journal, his fingers tracing his father's familiar handwriting. "I used to see him writing those," she said softly. "After I left, I'd drive by sometimes, see him sitting in the window with that journal. I never knew what he was writing, but he always looked so peaceful." "Reading them will take time," Robert said. "But we have that now, don't we? Time to share our stories, to understand each other better." The question hung in the air, heavy with hope and fear. Eleanor's diagnosis cast a shadow over the future, but somehow it made the present moment more precious, more urgent. "Yes," Michael said firmly, closing the journal but keeping his hand on its cover. "We have time, and we'll use it better this time." Sarah began serving the sauce over pasta, the steam rising like prayers in the warm kitchen. Outside, Denver's lights were coming on, twinkling like stars fallen to earth. In the bookstore below, thousands of stories sat quietly on their shelves, waiting to be discovered. But up here, in this kitchen, the most important story was still being written. One word, one moment, one heart at a time. Chapter 10. New Pages. A week had passed since the reunion dinner. The apartment above Second Chapters had transformed from Robert's quiet sanctuary into a bustling family home. Sarah had extended her stay, working remotely from a corner of the bookstore that Robert had converted into a makeshift office. Michael had arranged for local delivery routes to stay close to Denver, and Eleanor had begun her treatments at the medical center. The morning sun streamed through the bookstore's windows as Michael helped his father reorganize the shelves. They had fallen into an easy rhythm, working side by side as if the 25-year gap had never existed. "I was thinking," Robert said, sliding a worn copy of The Great Gatsby into place, "about your blog. Would you consider doing a reading here at the store? We have these Thursday evening events, and your stories about life on the road. They're exactly what our customers love." Michael paused, a stack of books in his arms. "A reading? I don't know, Dad. Writing is one thing, but speaking in front of people, like father, like son." Eleanor's voice came from behind them. She stood at the base of the stairs, looking tired but determined after her morning treatment session. "Your father said the same thing when I first suggested he do children's story time. Now look at him. The kids call him Papa Book." Sarah appeared from her workspace, laptop in hand. "Dad, you have to do it. I've been reading your blog to Grandpa's regular customers during my breaks, and they're fascinated. Especially the one about the elderly couple you helped when their car broke down in Wyoming." "That was just something that happened," Michael protested. "Nothing special." "Everything's special if you tell it right," Robert said, taking some books from Michael's arms. "That's what you taught me in that story you wrote. The one about the time machine. Every moment matters, even the ones that seem ordinary." Eleanor made her way to one of the comfortable reading chairs scattered throughout the store. "Besides," she added, "I'd like to hear them. Properly, I mean. Not just snippets I've caught Sarah reading." Michael looked at his former stepmother, noting how the morning light emphasized the pallor in her face, the slight tremor in her hands. Yet her eyes were bright, alert, hungry for stories and time and connection. "Okay," he agreed softly, "but I choose which ones to read." "Of course," Robert beamed. "We'll schedule it for next Thursday. Sarah, would you make us a poster for the window?" As Sarah and Robert excitedly discussed promotional ideas, Eleanor gestured for Michael to join her. He sat in the adjacent chair, remembering how she used to perch rigidly in their old home. Always proper, always controlled. Now she curled into the cushions like a cat seeking warmth. "I found some of your old notebooks in the basement yesterday," she said. Robert kept everything. There was one story, about a family of birds building a nest in a truck's side mirror. You wrote it when you were 12. Michael remembered. Dad had just started taking me on short hauls. We followed that truck for miles, watching the birds fly back and forth with twigs. You wrote that the birds taught you home isn't always a place, Eleanor said quietly. Sometimes it's just wherever your family is willing to build together. She paused, gathering strength. I wish I had understood that then. I was so focused on making the perfect home that I forgot about building a family. From the front of the store came the sound of Sarah's laughter as Robert demonstrated his different story-time voices. A customer wandered in, the bell above the door chiming softly. We're building now, Michael said. That's what matters. Eleanor nodded, then reached into her bag. I've been doing some writing too, she admitted, pulling out a thin notebook. The doctor suggested it, keeping a journal during treatment, but it turned into something else. Letters mostly. Things I should have said years ago to you and your father. She held out the notebook, her hands trembling slightly. You don't have to read them now, or ever if you don't want to. But I needed to write them, to explain everything. Michael took the notebook, feeling the weight of unspoken words in his hands. Dad showed me his letters too. I've been reading them each night, one at a time. 25 years of Sundays. I know. Eleanor smiled. I hear you sometimes, late at night, turning the pages. Sometimes you laugh, sometimes you cry. Robert sits in the kitchen those nights, waiting, ready to talk if you need to. The customer approached them, a young woman with a curious expression. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing. Are you the truck driver who writes the blog? My father's a trucker, and he shares your stories all the time. They make him feel less alone on the road. Michael felt his cheeks warm. Yeah, that's me. Would you sign his favorite post for him? The one about the birds building a nest. Eleanor and Michael exchanged a startled look. That's not from my blog, Michael said. That's a story I wrote as a kid. Oh, the woman looked embarrassed. It's on your blog, though, posted last Tuesday. A Memory of Wings, you called it. Sarah appeared beside them, grinning. Surprise, Dad. I found it in Grandpa's collection and posted it for you. Check your comments. Turns out you've been making people feel at home on the road since you were 12. Michael pulled out his phone, opening his blog. There it was. His childhood story, scanned and posted by Sarah, with hundreds of comments from drivers sharing their own stories of finding home in unexpected places. See? Eleanor said softly. Some stories need to be told more than once. Each telling brings new understanding. Robert joined them, carrying a fresh pot of coffee from the store's small cafe corner. Around them, the bookstore hummed with quiet energy. Customers browsing, pages turning, stories waiting to be discovered. And in the middle of it all, a family continued their own story, writing new chapters one day at a time. Chapter 11. Stories We Share. Thursday evening arrived sooner than Michael expected. Second chapters had been transformed for the event, with chairs arranged in a semicircle facing the reading corner. Sarah had outdone herself with the promotional materials, warm, vintage-style posters featuring an illustrated truck against a sunset sky, with the title, Tales from the Long Haul, Stories from the Road with Michael Anderson. The store was packed. Regular customers mingled with truck drivers who had detoured through Denver after reading about the event on Michael's blog. Eleanor sat in the front row, wrapped in a soft blanket despite the warm evening, her eyes bright with anticipation. Robert moved through the crowd, greeting people by name, while Sarah managed a small table of refreshments. Nervous? Robert asked, finding Michael in the back room where he was reviewing his notes. Terrified, Michael admitted. What if they don't like the stories? Robert squeezed his son's shoulder. They already love them. But that's not why they're here. They're here because your stories remind them that we're all connected, even when we're miles apart. Michael glanced at his father's office door, where his framed high school story still hung. Did you ever imagine we'd be here? Having a reading in your bookstore? Eleanor in the front row? Sarah manning the snack table? I imagined everything, Robert said softly. Every Sunday when I wrote those letters, I imagined 1,000 different ways we might find our way back to each other. None of them quite like this, but all of them ending with us together. The store's bell chimed as more people arrived. Sarah poked her head into the back room. Dad, there's someone here you might want to meet before you start. She led them out to find an elderly couple standing near the poetry section. The man wore a worn trucking company cap, and his wife clutched a printed blog post in her hands. "Mr. Anderson," the woman said, "we're the couple from Wyoming, the ones whose car broke down last winter. We read about your reading on the blog and, well, we had to come." Michael stared in amazement. "Mrs. Chen? Mr. Chen? You drove all the way from Wyoming?" "You stayed with us for hours in that snowstorm," Mr. Chen said. "Fixed our car, refused to take any payment, then wrote about it so beautifully. Made us part of your story." Eleanor had made her way over, leaning slightly on Robert's arm. "Michael's good at that," she said, "making people part of his story, even those who once tried to write themselves out of it." The store was completely full now. Sarah had to bring out extra chairs from the storage room. The crowd included people from all walks of life: truckers in work boots, business people in suits, families with children, elderly readers who had been coming to Robert's store for years. Finally, it was time to begin. Michael took his place in the reading corner, his notes trembling slightly in his hands. He looked out at the faces before him, his father beaming with pride, Sarah recording everything on her phone, Eleanor wrapped in her blanket, but sitting straight and attentive. "I've spent most of my life on the road," he began. "At first I was running away from home. Then, somehow, I found myself running towards something else. Toward stories, toward connections, toward understanding." He opened his notebook to the first story. Not one from his blog, but the one about the birds building their nest in the truck mirror. "This is where it all began," he said. "With a 12-year-old boy, his father, and some birds who taught them that home isn't always where you think it will be." As he read, Michael watched the faces in the crowd. He saw tears in Mrs. Chen's eyes, saw other truck drivers nodding in recognition, saw his father mouthing the words along with him. He had clearly memorized this story over the years. Eleanor reached over and took Robert's hand as Michael continued reading. Sarah moved quietly through the crowd, taking pictures, capturing this moment for their family archives. "The birds followed that truck for 300 miles, Michael read. "They knew something I was only beginning to understand, that love is stronger than distance, that family can stretch across highways and years, that sometimes the longest journeys lead us right back where we need to be." He continued with more recent stories, tales of midnight rescues and roadside kindnesses, of strangers becoming friends and lost souls finding their way. With each story, the connection in the room grew stronger until it felt less like a reading and more like a family gathering, everyone bound together by the threads of shared experience. When he finished the last story, the silence held for a moment before erupting into warm applause. People began sharing their own stories. Truckers swapping tales of the road, regular customers telling Robert how his bookstore had changed their lives, the Chens describing the snowstorm that had brought Michael into their lives. Eleanor made her way to Michael's side. "That last story," she said quietly. "About the driver who kept passing the same house every route, watching a family grow up through the windows, never stopping but feeling connected anyway. That was about us, wasn't it? About driving past the bookstore all those years?" Michael nodded. "I saw you once, you know, about 5 years ago. You were standing across the street watching Dad arrange the window display. I was making a delivery nearby. I almost stopped then. Why didn't you?" "Same reason you didn't come in. Wasn't time yet. Some stories need to wait for the right moment to be told." Sarah joined them, showing them the pictures she'd taken. There was one of Michael reading, his face animated as he shared his stories, another of Robert listening, tears streaming unashamedly down his face, and one of Eleanor, sitting wrapped in her blanket, but looking stronger than she had in days, surrounded by family and stories and love. The evening continued, turning into something more than just a reading. It became a celebration of connections found, lost, and rediscovered, of stories that needed years to find their endings, of families that could be rebuilt, one page at a time. Chapter 12. Full Circle. 6 months after the reading at Second Chapters, the bookstore had evolved into something more than just a place of business. The apartment above now permanently housed both Robert and Eleanor, with Michael occupying the spare room whenever his routes brought him through Denver, which was increasingly often. Sarah had transformed the store's back office into a permanent workspace, managing both her own career and her father's increasingly popular blog. On this particular Sunday morning, the familiar scent of spaghetti sauce wafted through the apartment. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, showing Sarah old photographs, while Robert and Michael prepared the weekly family dinner. "Your father wrote about this moment," Eleanor said, pointing to a faded picture of teenage Michael at a writing contest ceremony. In one of his Sunday letters, he described how proud he was, even though he couldn't show it then. "I've been digitizing those letters," Sarah replied, carefully scanning each photo, creating a family archive. Grandpa's customers love reading the story of how the store brought everyone back together. Eleanor's health had stabilized somewhat with the treatments, though everyone was acutely aware of the precious nature of their time together. She had good days and bad days, but she approached each one with a grace that continually surprised Michael. The controlling perfectionist, who had once driven him away, had been replaced by someone who found joy in life's imperfect moments. "Michael," Robert called from the stove, "taste this. I think I finally got your mother's recipe right." Michael stepped away from the cutting board where he'd been preparing garlic bread. He tasted the sauce, memories flooding back with the familiar flavors. "Almost," he smiled. "But you know what? I like it better this way. It's become your own version." The store below was closed on Sundays now, reserved for family time, though regulars knew they could still come up for dinner if they needed company. The Chens from Wyoming had become frequent visitors, and a rotating cast of truck drivers often stopped by to share stories and break bread. "I have something to show you all," Eleanor said, pulling out a familiar notebook, the one containing her letters. "I've been working on something new. Not just letters about the past, but stories about now. About how a bookstore can become a lighthouse, guiding people home." She opened the notebook, her hands steady today. "I want to publish them. Robert thinks they'd make a good addition to the store's collection about second chances." "Ellie," Robert said softly, leaving the sauce to simmer. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "These past 6 months, watching you all rebuild this family, seeing how Michael's stories touch people's lives, understanding finally what really matters, it's taught me that the most important stories are the ones we're brave enough to share." Sarah looked up from her laptop, where she'd been updating Michael's blog. "I could help with that. We could publish them alongside Dad's road stories and Grandpa's Sunday letters, make it a real family collection." Michael sat down beside Eleanor, taking in the scene before him. His father at the stove, his daughter planning their next project, his former stepmother sharing her heart in words. The sunlight streaming through the kitchen window caught the silver in Eleanor's hair, reminding him of that night on the highway when he'd first found her. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about that story I wrote as a kid, about the time machine." "The one that's still hanging in the office?" Robert asked. "Yeah. I used to think it was about the impossibility of changing the past, but now I think it was about something else, about how every moment is a chance to start again. We don't need a time machine. We just need to be brave enough to take the chances we're given." Eleanor smiled, touching the corner of her notebook. "Even when we don't know how much time we have?" "Especially then," Michael replied. "Because it's not about how much time we have, it's about what we do with it." Sarah closed her laptop and moved to help Robert with the garlic bread. "Speaking of doing something with time, Dad, I've been thinking, maybe it's time to expand your roots again." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Well, your blog readers keep asking when you'll visit their cities. And now that we have this whole family archive project," she gestured to the collection of letters, photos, and stories scattered across the table, "maybe you could do readings at bookstores across the country, share our story with more people." "A traveling bookstore," Robert mused. "Bringing stories to people instead of waiting for them to find us. And you'll always have a home base here," Eleanor added. "A place to come back to." Michael looked around the kitchen, at the sauce simmering on the stove, the family photos on the walls, the notebooks full of letters and stories and love. Outside, Denver's streets were coming alive with Sunday morning activity. Somewhere in the distance, trucks rolled down highways, carrying their own stories. "Home base," he repeated softly. "You know, those birds in my old story, the ones that built their nest in the truck mirror. They knew something I'm just now understanding. Home isn't just a place you stay. Sometimes it's a place you leave and come back to, over and over. each return making it more precious. Robert began setting the table, the familiar routine now infused with new meaning. "Second chapters," he said, smiling at Eleanor. "They never turn out quite like you expect." "No," she agreed, watching as her family moved around the kitchen they now all shared. "They turn out better." Sarah opened the window, letting in the spring breeze. Below, the sign for second chapters creaked gently, while inside, a family continued writing their story together, one Sunday dinner at a time, proving that sometimes the longest journeys can lead us right where we need to be.